Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I asked if you will at this time join me in which it is a process that some describe as the greatest psychological human achievement, the ability to remember. It's important for us to remember and reflect during this month of Black History so that we can reflect on the times, good and bad, so that we will not be doomed to repeat some of the errors and mistakes of the past. And so it is, Mr. Speaker, each day during this month, we remember the conscious contributions of African Americans in this Commonwealth and this nation. True history will reflect the history and her story that will show the best of humanity, honesty, decency, truth, courage, and yes, love. But the worst of that truth will chronicle many days of hatred of a people, and at the nastiest level, indifference. Today, as we reflect on Black history, we highlight the life and the legacy of a 5'2" giant, a giant of a woman who came from very meager means, Dr. Yvonne B. Miller. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, just as in the Bible records a very little known character, Shamgar, I liken that life of Senator Yvonne B. Miller as someone who started where she was, she used what she had, and she did what she could. It was often that she would say, I don't care what most people think. I just want to do what's right. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, she wasn't a temperature reader in the room. She was a thermometer. She changed the atmosphere. I can remember her saying often that, quote, God plus one is a majority. I want you to pull up on your imaginary YouTube minds and press rewind to 1983. And I bet you'll hear the bodacious, booming, beautiful, brave, broadcasting voice of the voiceless, Delegate turned Senator Yvonne B. Miller. Her strength was contagious, and even now her spirit lives on. She sat in this chamber in seat number 5. And I wonder whether or not her spirit has invoked a presence in that delegate, Don Scott. Senator Miller graduated in 1956 from Norfolk State University, where she later became a professor of childhood education. She also completed her studies at Virginia State University. She earned a master's degree from Columbia University in 1962 and a doctorate in education from University of Pittsburgh in 1973. She was an educator's educator. Her first teaching job in the city of Norfolk Public Schools in the late 1950s subjected her to the painful lessons of massive resistance, the state's institutionalized defiance of the Supreme Court order to desegregate public schools. Wow. She was a conscientious and awake human being. That bitter experience forged her outlook and imbued her floor speeches in the legislature with an authentic rage that commanded the silent attention of 139 other members of this legislature. She was conscientious and awake. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, yes, it is important to remember, because it was Senator Miller who denounced certain legislation that she thought was despicable in her eyes, based on Virginia's past. She spoke vehemently against bills requiring voters to bring identification documents to polling places. Also, who could forget her pointed floor speech regarding tolls, where she emphasized repeatedly, quote, "Tolls are taxes." Then there was the profound floor speech where she spoke against charter schools with a pitch of parrhesia and plain frank speech to say, quote, "Charter schools skim from the education of the masses, and it relegates the largest portion of the population of students to substandard education in many districts. Charter schools are like a kick in the gut. Before funding charter schools, we should fully fund public education," end quote. Wow, she was awake. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, while working for her, I was blessed to sit with her as she legislated and as she campaigned. She was a very wise woman with a tender heart and a passionate love for people. She believed in everyone's right to lift their voice. I recall once sitting with her when a gentleman who was on the other side of the issue said to her, "You just have to keep speaking, don't you?" And she said, "I absolutely do." His response, "Senator Miller, would you fight for me to be able to speak?" And she said, "Absolutely. I will fight vigorously for your opportunity to be absolutely wrong." Delegate Yvonne Miller shattered racial gender barriers simultaneously as the first African-American woman elected to Virginia's legislature. 4 years after being elected to the House, she did the same thing when she won her seat in the Virginia Senate. She was a career educator and an outspoken advocate for Virginia's poor and minorities in the Virginia Assembly. One writer described her this way, quote, "Senator Miller ascended from obscurity when neither women nor minorities had a voice in the legislature. To win a seat on the Budget Writing Finance Committee at the time in the Senate, as well as becoming ultimately the chair of Senate Transportation. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, Senator Miller made a difference. She was a conscientious and awake human being. She was the example of what Dr. Hugo Owens put pen to paper to write, that one woman awake can awaken another. The second can awaken her next door brother. The three of them awake can make such a fuss that finally it awakens the rest of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.